So what makes a cottage garden? It's Alexandra here from the Middle Sized Garden YouTube channel and blog, and I'm here with Clare Foggatt, who has just written a gorgeous big book called British Cottage Gardens, Beauty and Abundance. And so I'm going to ask her the questions that most people ask about how they can have a cottage garden in their own gardens. And we're here at Great Dixter, which of course is actually a very large garden, and you might not think it was a cottage garden, but actually it has many of the principles of a cottage garden, and there are so many little plant combinations and corners and things that really give us ideas for our own gardens. Clare is also editor of the English Garden magazine, and of course an English garden, and indeed a cottage garden, is not a purely British thing. It has recognition all over the world. It's more of a kind of relaxed garden style. So let's find out how to achieve it in our own gardens. Right, so Clare, the first thing you must be always asking yourself is what actually is a cottage garden? Because you presumably had to look at a number of gardens and decide whether they belonged in Beauty and Abundance or not.
Yes.
So how did you decide?
Well, I mean, it's the thing that I asked, and also the question that every single person that I've spoken to about the book has asked as well. You know, what's a cottage garden? What defines it? And it's actually really, really difficult. And as I started looking at the gardens and then trying to narrow it down, it almost got harder and harder, because there's a sort of tick list of elements of things that people associate with cottage gardens, like mixing edibles in with flowers and a certain higgledy-piggledy sort of charming informality and self-seeders and things like that. And not all gardens have them all, and then not all gardens have a cottage. You know, Great Dixter, where we are, certainly isn't a cottage, but it doesn't mean that the garden isn't cottagey. So yeah, it's a really woolly description and a woolly term, but in the end I think I came to the conclusion that if you can add up all the areas in your garden, and planting accounts for most of it, so more than any paving and landscaping and lawn, I think you're probably on the way to having a cottage garden. It's no surprise that all of the garden owners in the book are just absolute plant nuts. Like, you wouldn't be able to stop them buying plants. So yeah, planting is the key. Lots of abundant planting. That's the key.
Fill it with plants and you've got a cottage garden.
Pretty much. Although you kind of need certain plants, and they need to be really sort of packed in and really, abundant borders, really full of lovely, slightly old-fashioned things maybe, like roses, peonies, foxgloves, those kind of plants.
So what would you say are your leading cottage garden plants?
Well, definitely roses. I don't think you can't not have roses. And peonies as well. Self-seeders for sure. I think self-seeders are so crucial for creating that really relaxed style, because they just do the work for you and just pop up in haphazard places but always look nice and natural. So your foxgloves and honesty and sweet rockets and alchemilla mollis and smyrnium and things like that. So really lovely, kind of just slightly teetering out of control sort of feel that self-seeders bring. And then those kind of really nostalgic old-fashioned plants that people sort of associate with their grandmas sometimes, like lilac and honeysuckle and sweet williams and aquilegias, granny's bonnets, those kind of things.
Lovely. And of course you've mentioned the cottage. So does one have to have a historic or a charming house, or could you have a cottage garden outside a modern build?
Yeah, everyone can have a cottage garden. That's kind of the joy of it. And also, you don't need acres and acres, because originally cottages were quite small and it was just, the little plot outside, which is why they ended up cramming all, fruit and vegetables in together, because there wasn't that much space. So everybody can have a cottage. We've, in the magazine, have featured gardens in the middle of London that I would say, are a cottage garden, just because they're full of roses clambering over sheds and lots of those kind of really nice romantic old-fashioned plants.
And then of course the other thing people worry about is, can I have a cottage garden without it being too messy? How would you advise people balance that beauty and abundance with that messy feeling?
I hear those people, because it can really easily happen that you sort of cram in all these plants and it gets a bit bitty. There were a couple of gardens in the book. There was the one in Yorkshire, One Lane Top, where Susan Dobson had these sort of huge borders that were very cottagey, but she also had some really nice topiary. So just like, you know, a box ball or a little sort of pyramid, and just those things that sort of lend a bit of structure. So you have the billowy sort of fulsome planting, but then a nice solid blob of green, and just those little details just seem to anchor everything and just stop it from feeling like it's about to get completely out of control.
And although you've said, of course, hard landscaping is not the main thing about cottage gardens, what about hard landscaping? Has it got to be vintage and recycled and old, or...?
Not necessarily, but I think it probably does help if you really want to get that cottagey look. I wouldn't want some sort of brand new, very shiny porcelain tile, but there's so many lovely, you know, new but old looking stone pavers and sets that you can get. I think it's relatively easy to create that look without having to go and buy hideously expensive York stone, for example. But I mean, the garden on the Isle of Mull that we visited, Lipnacloich, Lucy, who gardens there, had just created the most incredible paths, because she's a beachcomber and she just combs the beaches on the island, and then you could see all these coiled ropes and fishing ropes and shells and all the stuff that she collected. She just inset into her paths and made them all herself, and you know, those kind of details just give the garden that homespun cottagey feeling.
And of course we are sitting here in Great Dixter, which is in many ways a very grand garden, but it's also, I can see why you say it's cottagey. What would you say are the things at Great Dixter that somebody could look at and then kind of reproduce at home in their own garden for a cottage look?
There's so much here, isn't there? I really, really like I'll probably get the name wrong, the High Garden and the Peacock Garden with the peacock topiary. I mean, that's so... Peacock topiary is very stately home, isn't it? It's about as far away from cottage as you can get, but the planting around it is just so frothy and romantic and dreamy, and sort of maybe not quite at this time of year, but in a month it will be full of cow parsley and all those lovely self-seeding verbascums and things that there are up there. And yes, it just looks glorious. And when I first started writing the book, I sort of shopped for a few second-hand cottage garden books on the internet and bought a copy of the book about cottage gardens that Christopher Lloyd wrote. And then during our interview, Fergus told me that actually it probably wasn't one of his favourite books, but there was a phrase in it, and I just thought, oh, jackpot, when I hit it, because he said that cottage gardening was all about bountiful yet regulated informality, which is a bit like we were just saying with the, you know, the self-seeders and the abundant planting that just looks like it's about to get out of control, but everything is regulated. And I thought, yeah, that actually that's the definition of a cottage garden, though obviously Christopher Lloyd, the expert, did a proper one.
Yes, I think that, because also when you think about a cottage garden, if it is small, it's also quite restricted in space, and that gives it a kind of definition as well, doesn't it? Yeah. Because the typical cottage garden is really like a path through a whole load of planting rather than a lawn or a terrace or anything. So what sort of paths would you suggest people have for cottage gardens? Do you see any really good paths in your book?
It wasn't just solid paths. I think even when you're doing the hard landscaping, people just couldn't resist adding plants. So there was a garden in the South Downs where she'd actually, Anne-Marie Powell, the garden designer, had helped her with the design, and it was originally a plain path, but the garden owner, Jackie, who we spoke to, wasn't that keen on it. So I think they added little thyme plants in between and put some sort of inset kind of sleeper-like sort of paving in the path to just break it up. So I think detail and just adding plants in any available inch of space. And you know, if you had a path like this one, there would be self-seeders popping up through the cracks. And at Val Bourne's cottage in the Cotswolds, there were Angel's fishing rods, which loads of us just long to grow, those beautiful arching fishing rods that are just impossible to grow. Val Bourne had them springing up out of her paving just outside of her cottage. And I can't imagine a true cottage gardener just going for a sort of really hard path of paving slabs with, you know, mortar in between. I think they would probably want to do something a bit more informal, let self-seeders come in, maybe break up, you know, have a pattern, that sort of thing.
And what about furniture? Is there much furniture at all in the book, for example? Would you say that furniture is a part of a cottage garden? Or?
Well, the other thing that I came away having finished the book knowing, I mean, I suspected it all along, but they're not low maintenance gardens. I think it's a bit of they might look informal and relaxed, but the people looking after them aren't necessarily relaxed, because they do take a fair bit of looking after. And one of the gardens we went to, I actually did the interview while the gardener carried on deadheading, so there's lots to do. And so I'm not sure there's that much time for sitting and relaxing really, but I guess, you know, I mean, there were some lovely items of furniture in some of the gardens, some really nice rustic benches, and I mean, yeah, anything that doesn't look too shiny and new, I think would probably fit in really well.
And you say it's high maintenance. I do occasionally see on things like Pinterest things saying like the no maintenance cottage garden. Is this an impossibility?
Well, you know, I don't know. I suppose, I mean, I think a no maintenance garden is a fib anyway, because no garden is absolute, doesn't, you know, there's always going to be a tiny bit of maintenance. But I've always maintained that, I mean, you were just saying about small gardens and there might not be room for a lawn. I would rather have a massive border to look after than a lawn. You know, a lawn needs cutting every single week if you mow it. Whereas a nice herbaceous perennial border, you could probably get away with a few days' work a year, as long as it's you stake if you need to. Then all you have to do really is just weed when it's young and there's soil around the plants, and cut it back once a year when it's died back, and that's pretty much all you have to do. So you could probably get away with a low maintenance cottage garden, but I don't think a no. But yeah.
Cottage garden flowers are probably the biggest thing in a cottage garden, so don't miss this video coming up next, which has got 25 of the best cottage garden flowers and how they'll thrive in your garden. And thank you for watching. Goodbye.